Somewhere in the world, right now, your phone is transmitting a signal. That signal travels through cables buried beneath oceans, bounces off satellites orbiting 40,000 feet above your head, and passes through relay stations on every continent. And somewhere along that journey, in a facility you've never heard of, run by people whose names you'll never know, that signal can be intercepted, analyzed, and stored. Not by a rogue government, not by a criminal organization. By an alliance so secretive that the Prime Minister of Australia didn't even know it existed, 27 years after it was created. This is the story of Five Eyes, and it begins not in a server farm, not in a glass-walled intelligence headquarters, but in a blacked-out mansion in the English countryside at midnight in February 1941. Five Eyes, the name itself sounds almost poetic. 5 nations, 5 sets of eyes watching the world, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Together, they form the most comprehensive intelligence alliance in human history. Their agencies share signals, share targets, share secrets, by default, automatically, in real time. And for most of the 20th century, the alliance that made all of this possible was hidden so completely that its founding document was described by historians as quite likely the most secret agreement ever entered into by the English-speaking world. It wasn't publicly acknowledged until 2005. Its full text wasn't released until 2010, and the system it created has never stopped running. To understand how it began, you have to understand what the world looked like in the winter of 1941. Europe was burning. Nazi Germany had swept across the continent with a speed that left the Allied powers reeling. Britain stood largely alone, battered by the Blitz, its cities scarred, its empire stretched thin across every theater of war. And the United States, technically neutral, was watching from across the Atlantic with growing alarm and growing suspicion that neutrality was a luxury it could no longer afford. In a requisitioned Victorian mansion north of London, surrounded by huts, antennae, and the quiet, obsessive focus of some of the greatest mathematical minds in the world, Britain was fighting a different kind of war. Bletchley Park was the nerve center of Allied code-breaking. Its mission, to penetrate the encrypted communications of the Axis powers, to read the enemy's mail before the enemy could act on it. And its greatest prize was Enigma, the German military cipher machine, believed by Berlin to be mathematically unbreakable. Alan Turing and his colleagues had proved that belief catastrophically wrong, but the volume of intercepted traffic was staggering, and Britain couldn't process it alone. Americans had something the British needed: resources, manufacturing capacity, mathematical talent operating independently on the other side of the Atlantic. And the Americans had something else. They had cracked Purple, the Japanese diplomatic cipher, with a machine they'd built entirely from scratch without ever seeing the original. That was a level of cryptanalytic sophistication that commanded British respect. But both sides had something the other wanted, and neither side fully trusted the other. On a stormy night in January 1941, 4 Americans boarded the British battleship HMS King George V off the coast of Maryland. Their cover story, Canadian diplomats. Their actual identity, the most senior codebreakers the United States Army and Navy could send. Abraham Sinkov, a mathematician from Brooklyn. Leo Rosen, Robert Weeks, Prescott Courier. They had been chosen for a mission so sensitive that their names couldn't appear on any official manifest, their destination couldn't be spoken aloud, and their instructions came directly from the highest levels of military intelligence. 2 weeks later, after crossing Sinkov described as punishing, they arrived at Bletchley Park at midnight. Alastair Denniston, the British head of the Government Code and Cipher School, had written just 3 words in his appointment diary: "The Wise are coming, the Yanks." And he had told his assistant to bring sherry, say nothing, and ask no questions. What happened inside that mansion over the following 10 weeks was unlike anything in the history of intelligence. The British showed the Americans the bomb, the electromechanical device designed by Turing and Gordon Welchman to crack Enigma settings at scale. They shared technical documents, intercept methodologies, decades of accumulated cryptanalytic expertise. Return, the Americans handed over a replica of the Purple machine, a gift, that gave Bletchley an immediate window into Japanese diplomatic communications. It was a trade. It was also a test. Both sides were measuring something harder to quantify than technical capability. They were measuring whether they could trust each other with secrets that, if compromised, could cost the war. Sinkov would later say that the 10 weeks at Bletchley saved American codebreakers 2 full years of work. 2 years. In a war where the margin between victory and catastrophe was measured in weeks. But this was still informal, still fragile, still dependent on personal relationships and wartime goodwill. What the intelligence community needed was something written down, something with signatures and protocols and institutional weight, something that would survive the departure of the individuals who had built the collaboration from scratch. That document came on the 17th of May, 1943. The BRUSA Agreement, Britain United States of America, signed between the U.S. War Department and the British Government Code and Cipher School. 7 pages, though what those 7 pages set in motion would reshape the global order. BRUSA formalized everything that had grown organically out of necessity: the exchange of personnel between code-breaking institutions, the sharing of cryptographic techniques, the dissemination of intercepted intelligence, the standardization of security protocols. Its language was unambiguous: complete interchange of technical data and special intelligence from sources covered. Complete, not selective, not subject to national discretion. Complete. One historian called it the written constitution of an intelligence partnership that would, in modified forms, continue to the present day. By 1944, the BRUSA circuit, connecting Washington, Pearl Harbor, Melbourne, Colombo, and London, was already transmitting every decrypt, every traffic analysis, every intercept considered worthy of dispatch. Melbourne, Colombo. The network was already global before the war had even ended. And then the war did end, and something strange happened. The partnership didn't dissolve, it transformed. For a brief moment, in the summer of 1945, there was a question, spoken quietly in the corridors of Whitehall and Washington, about what would come next. Wartime alliances had a history of evaporating the moment the shared enemy was gone. But the men running the intelligence services on both sides of the Atlantic understood something that the politicians were still grasping. The threat hadn't ended. It had changed address. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war with 11 million soldiers under arms, domination over half of Europe, and a nuclear program that American intelligence knew was far closer to completion than anyone in government wanted to admit publicly. The Enigma problem was gone. The Soviet problem was immeasurably larger. In September 1945, President Truman agreed in principle to continued post-war intelligence cooperation. It was a decision made quietly, without congressional debate, without public announcement. And between September and October of that year, British cryptographers Sir Edward Travis, Harry Hinsley, and Brigadier John Tiltman made repeated trips to Washington to negotiate what would come next. The momentum was building. And on the 5th of March, 1946, 2 men sat down in London and signed their names to a document that would remain hidden from the world for nearly 60 years. Colonel Patrick Marr Johnson, Lieutenant General Hoyt Vandenberg, representing, respectively, the London Signals Intelligence Board and the U.S. State Army Navy Communications Intelligence Board. The document they signed was formally titled the British-U.S. Communication Intelligence Agreement. Informally, it carried over the name BRUSA, though it would later be known as UKUSA, and its core principles were sweeping in their ambition: near-total sharing of signals intelligence. Standardized terminology, techniques, and procedures across both nations' intelligence apparatus. A commitment, on paper at least, not to surveil each other's citizens, and a division of the globe into spheres of primary collection responsibility. Between 2 nations, the entire planet had been carved up for monitoring. The scale of what had just been agreed upon was, in the words of Time magazine, when the document was finally released 64 years later, one of the most important things that happened in the entire Cold War. But 2 nations couldn't cover the globe, not alone, not with the technology of 1946. The Soviet Empire stretched across 11 time zones. Its military communications, diplomatic cables, and intelligence traffic emanated from every corner of Eurasia. Monitoring all of it required ears on every continent, in every ocean, at every latitude. And this is where the Commonwealth became strategically indispensable. Canada entered the alliance formally in 1948. The process was accelerated in part by a discovery that chilled intelligence services on both sides of the Atlantic. The Venona Project, the Allied effort to decode Soviet diplomatic cables, had revealed that Soviet intelligence had penetrated the upper levels of the Australian government, using assets inside Canberra to obtain classified British defence documents. The Commonwealth, far from being a passive beneficiary of the alliance, had become its most dangerous vulnerability. The solution was counterintuitive but strategically elegant: bring them inside the tent, make them full partners with full accountability, give them access, and give them responsibility. Australia and New Zealand followed in 1956, and with their inclusion, the Five Eyes network achieved something unprecedented in the history of statecraft: genuine global coverage. Britain monitoring Europe, Western Russia, the Middle East; the United States watching China, the broader Soviet Empire, Africa, the Caribbean. Australia with its eyes on South and East Asia, and crucially with Pine Gap, the secret surveillance station near Alice Springs quietly operated by the CIA, giving the alliance a listening post at the precise geographic center of the Indo-Pacific. New Zealand covering the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. 5 nations, 5 sets of ears, the entire surface of the Earth within reach. And none of it was public, none of it was debated, none of it had been put to a single democratic vote. The BRUSA circuit that had connected 5 stations during the war had become the skeleton of something without precedent. In the 1960s, the network began to evolve into what would eventually be called Echelon, a global surveillance apparatus capable of intercepting telephone calls, faxes, satellite transmissions, and eventually internet communications. The first formal Echelon network reportedly went operational in 1971. By the time a British journalist named Duncan Campbell published a piece called "Somebody's Listening" in the New Statesman in 1988, the system had been running for nearly 2 decades. The piece passed largely unnoticed. The American government still refused, in 2001, to admit that Echelon even existed. The secrecy surrounding this alliance was not incidental, it was architectural. The founding documents contained instructions printed in block capitals, to be kept under lock and key, never to be removed from the office. The agreement was classified at a level above top secret, accessible only to individuals cleared for what would eventually become the AUSCAN-NZ-UK-US Eyes Only classification tier. The term Five Eyes itself began as shorthand for that classification marking, a bureaucratic label, a file header, and then, gradually, the name of the most powerful intelligence alliance the world had ever seen. The secrecy had consequences that went far beyond operational security. Gough Whitlam, elected Prime Minister of Australia in 1972, didn't learn of the UKUSA Agreement's existence until 1973, 27 years after it was signed, when he discovered not only that the agreement existed, but that Pine Gap was being operated by CIA personnel without meaningful Australian oversight. He threatened to expose both. He was removed from office in November 1975 in a constitutional crisis whose full circumstances remain disputed. The intelligence historian Richard Aldrich has noted the extraordinary timing. The full truth of what role, if any, the alliance played in that crisis remains classified. The agreement's existence wasn't publicly acknowledged until 2005. Its full text wasn't released until June 25, 2010. 4 days later, Time magazine called it one of the Cold War's most important documents. 64 years of operational invisibility. 64 years during which the governments of 5 democracies were bound by commitments their own citizens didn't know existed, enforced by institutions their own parliaments couldn't oversee, operating under a treaty that no one had voted on. Now consider what that system had grown into by the time the public finally knew about it. Edward Snowden, a contractor working inside the NSA. Walked out in 2013 with documents that revealed the true scope of what BRUSA had built. PRISM, X-Keyscore, Tempora, the GCHQ program, tapping the transatlantic fiber optic cables that carry the majority of the world's internet traffic. A surveillance architecture that could, in Snowden's own words, collect nearly everything a user does on the internet. And that the NSA had been paying GCHQ at least £100 million between 2010 and 2013 for access to British capabilities, allies, partners, and now, quietly, client and contractor. Snowden described the Five Eyes as a supranational intelligence organization that does not answer to the known laws of its own countries. Think about that phrase carefully. Supranational, above the nation, above its laws, above its parliaments, above the mechanisms that democratic societies have built over centuries to constrain the power of the state over the individual. Here is the question that the history of BRUSA and UKUSA ultimately forces us to confront. The men who signed these agreements in 1943 and 1946 were not villains. They were dealing with genuine, existential threats, Nazi Germany, and then a Soviet empire with nuclear ambitions. The intelligence they shared almost certainly shortened the Second World War. The cooperation they built almost certainly prevented escalation during the most dangerous years of the Cold War. The case for what they did, in the context they inhabited, is genuinely strong. But the architecture they created didn't stop at the threats they were designed to address. It kept growing, the listening stations multiplied, the technology evolved, the targets expanded, and the democratic mechanisms that might have provided oversight, parliaments, courts, a free press, were kept deliberately ignorant of what was being built in their name. Not for a year, not for a decade, for 60 years. If the BRUSA agreement had never been signed, if Sinkov had returned from Bletchley with nothing but a handshake and a glass of sherry, the world might look very different. The Allied code-breaking effort might have remained fragmented, slower, less decisive. The outcome of the war in Europe might have extended by months, perhaps years, with consequences in blood and suffering that are impossible to calculate. The Cold War might have escalated into something far more dangerous without the intelligence integration that allowed both superpowers to understand, at critical moments, exactly how far the other was willing to go. The case for BRUSA's necessity is real. But so is this. The system it created has never been dismantled. It has only been expanded, upgraded, and reclassified. The 5 nations that agreed, in a blacked-out mansion at midnight in 1941, to share their secrets with each other have never stopped sharing. The agreement that was supposed to expire with the emergency that created it has outlasted every administration, every parliament, every prime minister who signed it into being. It has become, as one of its own architects described it, something closer to common law than to any document. A set of habits and trusts and institutional reflexes so deeply embedded in the intelligence cultures of 5 nations that no single government could unravel them even if it wanted to. The 5 eyes are still open, they have never closed, and somewhere in the world right now they are watching.